for WWF, based out of the EPO office. And here today, just to facilitate the conversation here, we have a couple of great panelists. Michael Matheson, no relation, but Scottish Government's Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero, Energy and Transport. So welcome, Michael. And Manuel Pugar Vidal, the global leader for climate and energy at WWF and president for COP26. It's a really great opportunity for me to come here and facilitate because I am from Scotland, sharing the same name with Michael, but I work with Manuel. So this is really exciting for me, and I hope we have a great discussion. So here what we're going to do is discuss the role of states and regions in achieving 1.5 and the part that Scotland can play in accelerating action from non-party actors. Just to let you know that we are delighted to say that we will be joined shortly by the First Minister of Scotland, that's the plan, to set out the government's commitments on increasing ambition and action on states and regions. So we're expecting an interjection in a few minutes, but I think we just want to start with the discussion first off with Michael and Manuel. So I'm just going to crack off with my questions. So the first one, we wanted to talk about the role of states and regions. Michael, I'm going to come to you first on this, but I wanted to sort of set us off with a question. Why do you think non-party actors are so important in our fight against climate change?
Okay, well, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much to WWF for organising this event and for inviting us along to take part in it. I think one of the key things around tackling climate change is that it may be member states of the UN who will sign treaties, but the reality is that the vast majority of the work and actions which will be necessary to achieve the changes required will be required from subnational and state level. I think it's estimated that in the region of anything between 50 to 70% of the actions which are necessary to tackle climate change very often fall within the gift of subnational, state or local authority level functions. Therefore, to get to create a change at a grassroots level that will be necessary to tackle climate change, that won't happen at a state level. That won't happen at a national level. That has to happen at a subnational level and at a state level. I think one of the real challenges here is to also recognise that for many people, the issue of tackling climate change can appear quite remote to them. It can appear as though it's being led by politicians at a national level, but to tackle climate change, it needs to take place at a personal, community, local level. And therefore, those who are engaged in this process at a local, community-based level need to have an input into determining what the actions are and how they should be taken forward at a global level. So I think that combination of creating the connection between individuals, local communities, and the change that's necessary means that subnational governments, state governments, local governments have to be seen as key players in tackling climate change. And then alongside that, we also need to recognise that the vast majority of the actions which will be necessary to affect change on a global scale will fall to the responsibility of subnational, state and local authority partners. And for that reason, they have a critical role to play in tackling climate change globally.
Thanks, Michael. That's a great sort of summary of the think globally, act locally sort of mantra, which I think is really great. Manuel, maybe we come for you. I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Shirley. You know that I went to Rio 92 almost 30 years ago. And I remember that at that time, we used to have two separate places. The Flamingo Park for the non-state actors and the Rio Convention Center with a lot of restrictions to access to. And that was the time in which we used to think that this was just a party's discussion. And then we move into the climate debate, because in Rio we got the climate change convention. And we move into the development of that convention to Kyoto. And still, we used to think at that time that just for parties, and even more, just for the Annex 1 parties. Also, just the most developed part of the world. But after that, when we started to think on what it would be after Kyoto, we failed in Copenhagen. And it is interesting how much human being it is used to understand by failing. And why we failed? Because we thought that we could be able to repeat what we had developed in Kyoto, and that was not true. At that time, the world was completely different. Year 2000, 2009, no, Copenhagen. And we started to understand that, okay, we must have a different approach from the top down to the bottom up. So, first, for sure, we understood the importance of having all parties taking not only decisions, but implementing it. But then also we started to understand the importance of convening non-parties. And that is why, and I am used to feeling very proud that in Lima we decided to launch this Lima Paris Action Agenda. That it was the first time ever in which this agenda was created. So I am used to thinking that most of the times it is by understanding processes and by going back to history that we can understand the evolution and why now are so important the non-state actors. But Michael, you mentioned also something important. Now we are not discussing an agreement. We are discussing implementation. And the only way to implement it is by moving this domestically, so to the national level, but also to the subnational level. Because if we are not able to do that, we won't be able to implement. And if we are not able to implement, we won't achieve our targets. That's as clear as that. So that is the second main reason of the importance of a non-state actor or non-party, whatever it could be the name of the agenda. But the third reason, it is about the economy, the importance of recognizing that there are different actors in the economy. So it is not just about the Minister of Finance, that for sure it's an important actor in any place, but also it is about the subnational governments and mayors, but it is about the business sector and many, many actors that can help to support the implementation in different levels. And that is why we created this agenda in 2014. Because I remember that when I went to Warsaw a year before, the business sector used to be outside the walls. And it was a time in which we don't used to have a green zone. So it was just a party discussion. And we created with a different name, Voices for Climate, the idea of a green zone in the Lima Paris Action Agenda. And that changed. And we did it by thinking in the economy and by thinking in the implementation on, at that time, we were aiming to get. And finally, we got it, fortunately, in Paris. And by the end, and also related to implementation, the fourth reason, it is that the only way to make an agreement as the Paris one, a well-implemented one, it is by understanding the social dynamic. And the social dynamic occurs in cities. It is. And also because we know the importance of cities in relation not only to emission, so how important actors they could be to cut those emissions. And also it is interesting because it is in cities that you can integrate the elements of the agenda. So you can develop an agenda for transport, for building, for solid waste management, for clean air, among many, many other topics. And that is what Scotland is doing with different plans, even with this voluntary NDC that you released or enacted in July, I think, 2021, so some months ago. So those are, surely, my point of view, the four reasons that make that non-state actors agenda so important.
Thanks, Manuel. Really resonates with me as we're talking a lot about pivoting into implementation and how it seems that states and regions, really their importance is only going to grow as we move on to implementing the NDCs. So great, thank you. So let's move on. I'm going to give you a double question here, Michael. What do you think should be done to involve states and regions in the UNFCCC? And if we think about the next couple of weeks at COP26, how do you think we can ensure that there's a legacy for states and regions by the end of our conference in Glasgow?
So I think there's a number of different layers here. So if you picking up on the point that Manuel was making, is that this decade has got to be the decade which focuses on delivery. So we're no longer at the point where we are looking to set targets. We know what we have to achieve. The science tells us that. And we need to focus much more on action and pace of change in order to meet our climate change targets. And from this COP, I think one of the things that's going to be absolutely critical is that state players at an international level have the level of ambition within their nationally determined contributions, which we know at the present moment doesn't reach where it needs to get to. So we need to see that level of ambition. But we need to see that level of ambition also reflected in the fact that subnational governments, states will play an absolutely critical role in the delivery of that. So if I take a practical example, let's take the UK. The UK cannot achieve its climate change targets unless Scotland decarbonises its energy system and we invest significantly in both onshore and offshore renewable energy. That's absolutely mission critical to delivering on climate change for the UK. But to achieve that, the Scottish Government has to create the regulatory framework and also put in place the actions that will be necessary to allow that to be achieved. So I think we're now, as Manuel rightly points out, we're no longer at the point of discussing what the agreement should be. It's about implementation of the agreement. So a success, I believe, from this particular COP would be a greater recognition and understanding of the role that subnational states and state players will have in the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and that they are critical to helping to support that. And what do I think should happen in order to help to facilitate that? I think as we move forward with COPs, they gradually evolve. And we always pointed out the progression that we've saw over the course of the last 10 plus years. I think as COPs grow and as it becomes more focused on implementation and action, there needs to be a greater role for subnational and state players in the dialogue that takes place at COP. Now, there's a number of different routes in which you could go about doing that. There's a number of different models. So, for example, if I was to give you an example, the Edinburgh process, which has been used for biodiversity, which was very much, as Manuel said, it was a grassroots up approach. It was facilitated by the Scottish Government and civic-based organisations, which is much more about working up from the bottom up to create the change in biodiversity, which is closely linked to climate change. I think we need to get moving much more in that direction going forward in future COPs, recognising the role that needs to build up from the grassroots to create the type of policy implementation and framework that will be necessary to tackle climate change. So my view on both of these questions is that a successful COP will recognise that as we move towards implementation of the Paris Agreement, that subnational governments have a much bigger role, an important role in its implementation. And as we move forward in the future, is that they have a bigger role to play in determining how that implementation is taken forward as well in future dialogue and discussion. And that, in my view, would be a positive both for subnational governments and also, I think, for achieving a more successful outcome from COP. Because if it's left at that national level continually, we will not see the change and the pace of change that's necessary. And you can see, we're discussing earlier on, in the United States, during the course of the previous US administration, when it withdrew from the Paris Agreement, it was at a state level where action was still being taken to tackle climate change in states like New York and California. They were critical to helping to make sure they maintain progress in tackling climate change. So I think we need to understand that as we progress, that to achieve the transition and pace of transition that will be necessary, subnational governments and state governments are going to be absolutely essential to making sure that happens, and to do it in a way that is just and fair in delivering a just transition.
Thanks, Michael. I'm just going to just selfishly interject because I have the mic to say congratulations to Scotland, because you've taken great steps on this with your subnational NDC, and that's something that us at WWF has recognised through our NDC-B1 initiative. We're assessing all parties' NDCs coming in, and Scotland is the only and first one that we have that's a subnational NDC, and you got a great review from us on that, so congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Manuel, I turn to you. Maybe if you want to add to Michael's
probably
remarks.
a couple of things. And Michael, really interesting what you mentioned by the end of your last intervention. It's amazing how well the non-state actors agenda could be a political firewall for the nihilism. No, that happened in the US. So the US still in demonstrated how useful it was for those times of denialism and resistance to implement the Paris Agreement. Now it has evolved into America's is all in, and for sure it is keeping some role, but also readjusting to the new reality of the US. And for sure, it is not the case of the US, the only one that we could suffer in the future. So we know since the beginning of the Paris Agreement, I used to say the Paris Agreement, it is as driving from northern Canada to southern Argentina, in which we will have different roads, probably some more difficulties in some places. But as former President Hollande mentioned, the Paris Agreement, it is irreversible and unstoppable. No? And that is something in which we must insist on. But in relation to that question also, let me say that when we think in COP26 and what are the opportunities to continue strengthening the subnational government role, for sure, the Marrakesh Partnership and its strengthening into that Marrakesh Partnership 2.0, and in that sense, the two champions, the Chilean and the UK one, they have done a great work. It is a place through the race to zero, the race to resilience, and the sectorial breakthroughs. No, it is a place through which the cities can strengthen their agenda, but also through the sectorial entry point. Again, as I mentioned, it could be because of transport of some of those sectors. But let me add something, Michael. We know that we still have a gap to cover in sense of ambition. We have just heard from some weeks ago what UNFCCC is saying, that with current NDCs, we could raise temperature by the end of the century of around 2.7 degrees Celsius. Welcome, First Minister, please.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Thank you and welcome, First Minister. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Okay, so that is again 3 points, goals, but probably if we were able to think on the role of subnational governments, probably that would be the best way to cover the current ambition gap. And probably in many cases, many governments have not thought on that. How much by bringing more closer subnational government, they could close that gap. So things are evolving positively. I am used to being optimistic on this process. We don't need to keep and to continue pushing the process forward because it is feasible. But we do need to continue involving more subnational government and more non-state actors into this. And let me finish this intervention by saying the first time we met First Minister, it was, I think, in Bonn, in the presentation of the yearbook for the non-state actors 3 or 4 years ago, probably a bit more. So thank you for that, because since the beginning, you have been committed and involved in that role of subnational governments and non-state actors into the climate agenda. And let me add the last thing. And now, let's start to think in the connection in between climate and nature. That is key. We are also in a time of promoting convergence, and to start to think how much by working on nature we can achieve our climate objective, and to think on how much nature-based solutions for cities, for example, could be a good tool to continue promoting our climate action and to move the world into the 1.5 and to be net zero and resilient by half of century. And for sure, in relation to that adaptation, it is a key element.
Thanks, Manuel. Welcome, Nicola. Welcome to the Panda Pavilion on behalf of WWF. I'm just here filtering questions. We've just had a great discussion with Manuel and Michael on the role of states and regions, and you actually come at the perfect timing. So maybe if I can turn to the role of Scotland and ask you the question that we have here is, what do you think is the role of Scotland and other non-party actors in driving global ambition and action?
I think we've got a massive role to play. You know, I'm not going to betray any secrets here when I say I would prefer Scotland to be round the negotiating table here in our own right, pushing forward. But short of that, we've got to make sure we're doing everything we can. First and foremost, that means doing the things we need to do and winning credibility. Scotland, I think by any measure, can claim to be a world leader in climate action, but the bar of world leadership is far too low. So it doesn't take enough to be a world leader. We've got to up our own ambition and delivery against that ambition. But we've also got a big part to play in corralling the subnational governments, cities, regions, devolved governments like ours. Because if we look at what is required in terms of emissions reductions to meet 1.5 degrees, about half of the total reduction required to achieve that requires action on the part of governments like the Scottish government, subnational governments. So if we don't play our part, the world won't get where it needs to be. We are the European co-chair of the Under 2 coalition. The member governments of the Under 2 coalition represent almost 2 billion people across the world. So it's a practical reality that if we don't play our part, we're not going to meet that global ambition. But that doesn't let the countries that will be around that negotiating table over the next 2 days off the hook. They have to absolutely step up and do everything that is required of them as well.
Great, thank you. Manuel, I don't know if you want to add to that from your experience. What do you think non-party actors can do to drive ambition, and what do you think the role Scotland could play in the next 2 weeks?
Since the beginning, because I remember that some years ago I was here and I highlighted all what Scotland is doing and working on strengthening their own climate plans. That is fantastic, because it is not just something that you did some years ago and you haven't never updated. You are keeping an update of your targets, plans, also to think about decarbonization. And what it is so important, First Minister, it is your just transition, because you have a just transition commission. And that is a key element. And sometimes we are not used to thinking on just transition. And sometimes we are thinking that just transition, it is just for the global south or for the poorest or the less developed countries on the world. And that is not true. It is for around the world, because the level of vulnerability, it is affecting the whole world. Let's see what it has just happened in, not just, but some months ago in Germany with floods, or with the fires in the Mediterranean, or in California with the fires happening, not just, but some months ago in Germany with the floods, or with the fires in the Mediterranean, or in California with the fires. So that is something that it is key. And I am all the time thinking in the just transition, for example, for the Amazon, because we know that the model for the Amazon could be unfortunately be converted in a savanna, And also because the current ecosystem of the Amazon, it is strongly dependent of fossil fuels. So we do need to know that if that is the model, and if that is the dependence of that economic activity, and we are planning to phase out fossil fuels as soon as we can, we have to start to think on a just transition. So that is why the importance of those kind of commissions, First Minister, and also your ability to update and to keep updating your climate plans. So the role of cities, it is so important. The role of subnational government, it is so important because the level of people that we could engage, but also the promotion of more awareness, more conscious. The connection, it is on cities. So it is about not only production, but also consumption. We know how much a good and responsible consumer could contribute to the climate crisis. And the best way to do it, it is on cities. By engaging both who are producing and who are consuming. Because it is the only way, it is not just about the business sector and to blame the corporation. Also, it is about us. And that responsibility is mostly on cities. So cities and subnational and regions. So that is why I think that it is so important to have good examples as Scotland to continue developing this kind of plans.
Thanks, Manuel. Yeah, Nicola, maybe I'll come to you with another question. You've given a few examples, but it'd be great to hear a little bit more on your thoughts and reflections. How the Scottish Government, I mean, like you say, we don't have a seat at the table, but we want to be an inspiration at COP26. So how is the Scottish Government working domestically and internationally to accelerate action and encourage other governments to do so when it comes to climate change?
So firstly, briefly domestically, we can only have credibility in trying to push other countries if we are doing what we are required to do. Manuel talked about the importance of us updating and reporting against our climate targets every year. We've got legally binding annual targets. And much is made rightly of the fact that we haven't quite met those targets for the last 3 years. So we have to publish catch-up plans. But actually, while I want to meet the targets, I would rather have ambitious targets that we fall marginally short of, because we will achieve more that way than having targets that are not at all stretching that we leap over every year, because we will do more with the former than with the latter. So leading by example, being a voice for the action that has to be taken globally at summits like this, and using, albeit a relatively small power and spending power, in ways that set an example. So one concrete example today, having been the first country almost a decade ago to establish a climate justice fund, today we've become the first developed country to say that we are going to commit resources to loss and damage projects internationally. That's trying to set an example. The amount of money that we can dedicate by international standards is relatively small, but the power of the message is almost as important as the quantum of the money. And here, making sure the voices are very loud for what has to be done coming out of here. I'm looking around the walls here. Every climate promise must be kept. Frankly, none of them are being kept right now. You know, climate finance, which should be the relatively easy bit for developed countries to deliver, isn't being delivered yet. Time to deliver, no excuses. These messages have to ring out through summits like this, and we've got a part to play in trying to ensure that is the case.
Thanks, Nicola. Yeah, great remarks. I think the promises also need to be more ambitious, so there's a lot to do on that regard.
Sure, I agree they need to be more ambitious, but if the unambitious ones aren't even being met yet, we've still got, you know, I've just come from meeting Greta Thunberg and Vanessa Nakati, and, you know, those voices often, including for people like me, are really uncomfortable at times because they make us confront the hard realities of our own lack of delivery. But my goodness, they are so important to shake, you know, the sort of gatherings that will take place in here over the next few days out of the sense of complacency that surrounds them all too often.
Completely agree.
And I know, First Minister, I know that you have to run quickly. Two things. Also, the role of cities for adaptation. That is a key element. I remember it was probably Bonn again, that I had a panel with the mayor of Oslo and the mayor of Moldova, Liberia. It was like, wow, amazing, the big difference in between. So when I was the moderator, and I asked them to switch the roles. And I asked the mayor of Oslo, seeing that you are in charge of Liberia with Ebola, tuberculosis, and all those kinds of problems. And it is so difficult because the level of needs of adaptation are key elements in many, many cities. And you mentioned something, First Minister, that it is so important. How to connect climate finance with cities, with subnational government. I think that there is a strong room to keep that agenda in the top, because probably we haven't yet gotten that level of putting too close the financial flows to the needs of cities or subnational government.
We haven't got anywhere near as close as we need to be. We talk, because we're still talking about meeting the target of the quantum, we're not yet talking in enough detail about what that money has to do, and all of the different uses of it. But you said something there that I think is quite interesting, and reflecting on when we last met in Bonn, and asking somebody from Oslo to imagine, being in Liberia. Now, I'm not suggesting any of us can ever imagine the scale of challenges, but actually since then, we've all had to confront this a challenge on a scale that we'd never contemplated before in the form of a global pandemic. And the ingenuity and the sense of urgency brought to bear on that, vaccines being developed from a standing start. Now, some of that is what we need to now bring to bear on this. So yeah, it's not quite what the reality is in places like Liberia, but we've all confronted emergencies over the last couple of years that should completely change our mindset on what is achievable and what is not achievable.
To abandon North Sea drilling, to abandon Cumbrian coal mining, to take meaningful action against bovine agriculture.
I'm trying not to interject, but I know that the First Minister has to move on soon, so maybe you could keep your intervention short.
I've got to move on to the opening ceremony, where I might get to see Boris Johnson, so if I get the chance, I'll pass on your message. But it's a message to all of us. Not the UK government is effectively the leader of this COP, so they have a particular responsibility. But you're right. We should be. Let's not move away from the word actor. Let's make sure it means what it is intended, not pretending to do things, but doing things and doing the right things. You take oil and gas. That's all countries have really difficult issues to confront. For a country like Scotland, oil and gas is the most difficult. Tens of thousands of jobs dependent on that. But that can't be an excuse for saying, let's just keep going, drilling for oil and gas indefinitely, because that's catastrophic for the planet. So instead, facing up to that is our biggest challenge, and working out how we move away from it as quickly as possible. That's what we're trying to do, to create the alternative jobs so that we're not leaving people on the scrap heap. If we only face up to the relatively easy things, we won't get anywhere. So you're right to say this has to be a moment that leaders, all of us, whether we're around that negotiating table or not, are really held to account for the reality of what we promise, not for the rhetoric of it. And what can everybody do? Make life really uncomfortable for any government, any leader that's not doing enough. At times that will be my government, and rightly so. We've all got to be pushed much harder, much faster. This summit should not feel comfortable for anybody in a position of leadership and responsibility. It should feel bloody uncomfortable because nobody yet is doing enough, and that's the reality.
Thanks very much, Nicola. As a fellow Scot, I'm looking forward to following you at this conference and really seeing how we shine as Scotland. So thank you very much. And thank you so much for joining us today. I think you're going to be ushered out the door now, but we're delighted to have you on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for allowing me to be here for a short period.
Great. Thanks very much, Nicola. We have fast run out of time, and I apologize, Michael. I didn't forget you at the end of the panel, but it was very difficult to sort of get to in the end. But I know you've got a really tough role. Your mandate is net zero energy and transport. So I just wanted to give you the space if you wanted to add anything to what's been said here about the role of Scotland and how ambition targets can be part of this from your perspective.
Well, look, thanks very much. It was good. It was great the First Minister was able to join us for a period. I think I've got a new role, and it's a new role that's been created in government in trying to coordinate the government's wider strategic approach to tackling climate change and driving forward the net zero agenda, which brings its challenges, but it also brings very significant opportunities. I want to maybe pick up on a practical example to illustrate the importance of subnational governments in driving forward some of this agenda in practical policy terms. If I was to say to you that Scotland has 25% of Europe's offshore wind energy capacity, would you be surprised? If I was to say to you that we not only have about a quarter of Europe's offshore wind energy capacity, we also have about a quarter of Europe's offshore marine energy capacity. So in order to achieve that, as a devolved government, we need to create the regulatory framework to help to support that transition from an energy sector in oil and gas, which is heavily dependent upon extracting hydrocarbons, to one which is much more dependent upon renewables, and to do that in a just and fair way. To achieve that, a devolved government, the Scottish Government, has to take the right regulatory actions and policy actions to facilitate that. If we get that right, Scotland benefits, our environment benefits, the UK benefits, but Europe and the wider world benefits, because as major industrial economies such as Germany look to decarbonise, they're going to be very heavily dependent upon hydrogen, and green hydrogen in particular. And Scotland has the massive potential to be a net exporter of green hydrogen across Europe. That in itself then helps to speed up the whole process of decarbonising major economies across Europe. So I think if there's anything I would say from my role, and one of the things that has struck me the most since I've come into this post in the last couple of months, is that subnational governments, devolved governments, local government, whatever state level governments, whichever country you're in, are absolutely mission critical to delivering on a just and fair transition. And I think Manuel makes a very good point, is that the deficit at an international level can be addressed by subnational and state governments. And what we need to do is to ensure that the UN recognise that potential role, and that we start to have dialogue on an international level that helps to support and aid that. Some of that's taken place through the Under 2 coalition, etc. But I think at a UN level, there's an opportunity to set that in a direction that can help to create change and transition in a way and at a pace that is much faster than is presently being proposed by states at a national level. And in doing that, we will get the pace and the energy and the ambition that's necessary to meet our climate change targets.
let me add something that probably is related to what you are working on, Michael, and also related to our friend in the audience that made that question about energy. There are two elements in which we must continue working on. The first one is cooperation, because lack of cooperation in the energy sector is promoting that everybody is looking for their own source of energy around the world. The pandemic has shown us how poor cooperation we had mostly in the beginning, even in Europe, in which every country took their own decision to address their own problem. Now let's move this into energy. And it is the lack of cooperation in relation to energy that it is creating not competing relation, but that everyone is looking to, and this is my second concept, energy security. We must switch the concept energy security, that we know that it is the most affordable source of energy for a functioning economy, and look how much we can include to that concept the climate considerations. Because if we keep it as for years it has been the concept, countries will continue extracting their most affordable source of energy. So that is the point. And if we are not able to cooperate, no, we will continue having this situation in the energy sector when we do need to switch all that behavior. So cooperation, it is a key one. It is a key element, and energy security concept, it is something in which we should continue discussing deeply to switch and to bring into that consideration the climate consideration. That is for me two key elements to complement, no, what are the problems with energy.
Thanks, Manuel. We've sort of run over on time a little bit, so I'm going to do a quick wrap up. But I just want to say thanks very much. I will say, as a from the north, it would be wonderful if we could say we're harnessing the energy for good and getting energy out of it, especially with our wonderful weather here. I think we really need to start making use of it. But yeah, great comments from everybody. Thanks so much. As a quick wrap up, thank you everybody for coming. I think the Scottish Government, WWF, are going to be doing more this week on talking about the role of states in the context of climate. WWF Scotland will have events on, so you're all very welcome. Michael, maybe you could join us for some. We're doing one on just transition, net zero, and agriculture. So hopefully you can join us. But that's everything for us. Thank you so much for joining.